Hey guys, how's it going? KRIPP'S here. So we have some build guides for you guys. I know these are overdue, but I wanted to kind of wait out the review period so we can get the information from basically everyone, what they learned, their experiences. And I don't have any footage from that, but I did play a little bit, so I do have some hands-on experience with the builds that I'm going to showcase. There's going to be 4 build guides coming up for Diablo 4's release. And I have 3 Sorc builds and 1 Necro build. I believe I will be playing a Sorcerer. I also wanted to wait for the preload. So these videos are after the preload. There are changes. Most of them have to do with the Paragon system and its glyphs. And those will be talked about in the coming videos as well. So let's get started. The first video is the Firewall build. This is the build that I touted as my top contender. I think it might not be quite my top contender anymore because the glyph changes actually made damage over time and fire builds as well a little bit weaker than before. And they were pretty close before. They were actually pretty balanced. Nevertheless, Firewall, Sorcerer, what can you expect? It's first off a good starter. Chances are a lot of Sorcs will be playing the early version of this build because it doesn't really require a whole lot, and it is pretty good because the baseline Firewall skill is very strong. Has very high AoE DPS. It's super tanky, has great recovery, and it has some of the strongest crowd control. Even though it's not like an ice build, it's because we actually get a lot of legendary powers and items with crowd control duration. The real goal for a lot of Sorcs in the coming first issue of Diablo 4 is going to be making a character around Frost Nova, having enough cooldown reduction to make Frost Nova have a low enough cooldown, and scaling the duration of the freeze to where a Frost Nova lasts as long as its cooldown. And yes, that is possible with enough investment, and if you get there, you're going to have a ridiculously powerful character. Downsides, it is pretty slow. Very slow in some cases compared to other builds that are on the faster side. It just, the Firewall does a lot of damage, but it's over 8 seconds. So there are some pacing things. You can kind of figure out when mobs are probably going to die and you can just walk away from them. But still, it does take a while. The damage certainly has to ramp for it to work out. And the Firewall playstyle is not really for everyone. The best way to use Firewall, and I haven't actually seen many people use it properly, is to cast it right next to your character, but in a perpendicular fashion with the mouse click, so you can run along your Firewall so monsters can stay in it for many cases the full duration. That can be annoying for some people, but I actually found it pretty fun. It's kind of like a little mini game while you're playing in a way. Now, Firewall is a very interesting skill. A huge amount of the damage comes from the enchantment. The enchantment for Firewall is 5% when you do burning damage to spawn 2 firewalls for 3 seconds. Now, these firewalls use your other firewall like nodes, so you have like if a mob is in your firewall, it still burns for 3 seconds later. Basically what that means, if you get a firewall proc, the mob can be moving. It's going to take the full damage from the double firewall proc, so it's really nice. Effectively, the mob's going to sit in a firewall of yours for 6 seconds. That's basically it. But a proc 5% chance is pretty good. Now, I am going to guess on how it works. I don't believe it's lucky hit based. Hydra cannot proc Firewall, even though it does burning damage. And I tried a bunch of skills. I tried like Charge Bolt with the Firewall enchant and the Fire Bolt enchant. So I'm doing like 5 or 6 burns at the same time for each cast. And actually, it was proccing fewer firewalls than Firewall proccing Firewall. And Firewall is only just the burn. It's not 5 burns. So how does that work? I believe that Firewall's proc does not count each individual burn applied to the target. Burn damage is dealt twice per second, so in the full duration of a Firewall, you have 16 ticks of burn if the mob is in the Firewall for its full duration. But while you can have a whole bunch of different burns from different sources and all that. I think there is a difference between like an area ground burn and the burn on the target, even though they don't show up as different values in like the damage tooltips. I think that's why when you have like 5 or 6 firewalls on a boss, the firewall is actually proccing constantly. So why would it proc constantly if the burns don't stack, you know? This is where I'm getting at. So I think you have the 5% chance every half second if it's just burning from anything, like it could have walked out of a firewall or just anything. You have 5% chance every half second, but also you have 5% chance every half second if it's in a burn zone. There's not a lot of burn zones. The other burn zone that is fairly reliable other than Firewall is Meteor. So even though Firewall doesn't proc a lot of meteors, the meteors that proc from Firewall have a really good chance to proc more firewalls because it's a burn zone. And also we can skill up the meteor for it to have the immobilize effect, and the immobilize effect will be very strong. Now that is a bit of a lead up to a build, but let's get into it. And we are going to get into it on Mobalytics. KRIPP builds will be hosted on Mobalytics. If you guys want to check out any build that I've made, any build I might be playing, that's where you're going to want to go. And I got a link in the description for you guys. Now, they just started their Diablo IV category, so some of the features they are still working on, and that's why the Paragon board section is fairly minimal right now, but the basics are there. But I will also include the full build so you can see every single node with the Paragon system that I've kind of gone through more or less. All right. So the build starts off with Firebolt, but you don't actually use Firebolt. You just have to use 2 points in the basic skills. For core, we just get the defenses of Potent Warding, so we just get a few extra resistances, a little bit of extra mana. Mana can be pretty useful to have a little bit extra of. Go over that in a second. We actually use every defensive skill. While Ice Barrier is not skilled, we actually use Ice Barrier, and that's because one of the best stats we want on an amulet is defensive skills. Defensive skills gives you +1 all defensive skills, but in Diablo IV, if you have plus to a skill category, or in the case for Harlequin Crest, if you have plus skills, it actually gives you the skill. Okay, that's different from prior Diablo games. Diablo IV gives you the skill even if you don't have it spec'd. So we use Ice Barrier, even though we don't spec Ice Barrier. We can spec it while we're leveling if you want. Flame Shield with the heal. I found the heal to be super valuable. Teleport with the damage reduction. We want to be casting this at least every 5 seconds. And we have 5 points in Frost Nova just to really get the cooldown as low as possible. Frost Nova is extremely important because it is realistically the only main source of vulnerable you're going to get on a Sorc. The other sources of vulnerable are just not good enough. And vulnerable and crit damage, unfortunately for this build, are the only 2 major multipliers. So every Sorc build is going to have to go crazy with Frost Nova. If you see a Sorc build that doesn't have many points, if not 5 points in Frost Nova, it's probably not optimized. I do get Glass Cannon, but I think that Glass Cannon might not be worth taking. Damage seems to be quite good, especially because this build is so tanky. But if getting Glass Cannon means you're going to get one-shotted versus not, you can move some points around. For Conjuration, we get all the passives. We get the Align the Elements. So Align the Elements gives you damage reduction for the next hit you take from an elite. Elite includes players, bosses, all that kind of stuff, champions. Now they nerfed this. It used to be that if you had a barrier and you didn't take life damage, this buff stayed up. They also nerfed the rate that this buff generates on your character. It used to be, I think, 5% per point. So now, even if you have all 3 points in it, it's going to take you like 13 1/3 seconds to get it to maximum stacks. That's a long time. And because it goes down a fair amount, well, if you're really good with Frost Novas, maybe not. I do encourage much more than 1 point. I think 2 points is the minimum. It's a very strong damage reduction mechanic, and a lot of builds I see only have 1 point in it. If you have only 1 point in it, it takes 40 seconds to charge back up. 2 points, 20 seconds. That's a huge difference. 3 points, I'd still probably get if you can. We get protection for big barriers. Barriers, you have to think of them in Diablo IV like a heal and temporary health, because it stops you from getting one-shotted, and the damage will just goes away. You don't have to heal the damage that you take. So barriers are really strong. Every time you spend 100 mana, you gain 15 damage reduction for 5 seconds. This is pretty optional, but I think with the mana system for this build, it stays up well enough. We max Firewall, and we get the burning after. You have to get this one. It's not playable without. Do not get the mana regen one. And we skill Meteor because we want the passives, but we only have 1 point in it. We're not really using Meteor for the damage. A big part of Meteor's damage is the hit damage, and we don't actually care about the hit damage that much. What we care about is the fact that it has a burning ground, the fact that we can get a second Meteor, and that it immobilizes is the most important thing, and we'll go over that in a second. We get Inner Flames, Pyromancy skills, X9 damage. This is a multiplier. And I do get the lucky hit Immobilize. And we'll go over that in a second. But this actually procs, a fair amount. It helps you stagger the boss, and any kind of mobilize effect is going to give you a huge damage boost. I get Inferno, but I think Deep Freeze is also a great option. Inferno kind of pulls targets in the same spot, which can be very valuable, especially for Firewall, because those procs start to happen all in the exact same spot. But I do like Deep Freeze as well. If you're dying a lot, Deep Freeze is a decent choice. Supreme Inferno makes your Pyromancy skills cost no mana during the Inferno, which can be very good if you don't have your mana systems in check. Fiery Surge is the lead up to Endless Pyre. This gives you more burning damage the longer the target is burning. And Warmth is one of the strongest defensive mechanisms if you're not getting one shot. So I do recommend you get all 3 points. And for the big passive, we get Combustion. It's really hard to say what counts as a unique source of burning, but I believe each Firewall counts as a unique source of burning among different skills other than Firewall, of course. So I think Combustion is actually super strong. The Sorc ultimates are generally on the weak side compared to or the capstone passes, whatever they call them, generally weak compared to other classes. So it's good to get damage if you can out of it. I'm not going to go over the recommended gear stats, but I'm pretty confident in them. So if you do want to see what it's about, we're generally looking for vuln damage, because vulnerability is almost always going to be a multiplier. Crit damage we will convert in the Paragon system. I will explain that shortly. And the rest is mostly damage reduction. This is a very tanky build for a Sorc. Lucky hit while you have a barrier. This is probably the least important legendary power, but it's a nice lead up if you find a Harlequin crest, because it's not a big loss. The armor one is very good. Each tick of burn from each source, each Firewall in this case, stacks up this, so it's very easy to get maximum stacks. Edge Masters, so generally it's good if you're casting on high mana. It works pretty well with Inferno, even if you do have mana problems in the build. Everliving, we have lots of crowd control, and we have vulnerable, so it's very nice defensively. Increase damage to vulnerable while you have a barrier. Yeah, it's double condition, but it's a double condition that we meet, and a lot of our burst happens during the Frost Nova. Increase damage during a barrier. We have a lot of barriers. So this one is, Exploiters. Okay, Exploiters is fine. Increase damage if they have Unstoppable. They're generally not going to get Unstoppable too often. Long crown controls, if they're not being spammed too often, actually don't trigger Unstoppable very much at all, is my experience. Smiting. This one is a little bit my tech here. I haven't seen a single Firewall build with Smiting, but I do think that crowd control duration is so important that it is one of the best even damage aspects. You can get 40 crowd control duration from Smiting, and you get 20 critical strike chance against Injured. Injured is 35% or less health. And why would you want crit? Well, we actually have a lot of crit damage and Meteor crits sometimes. And the meteors, they usually happen later in the fight. You start off with a bunch of firewalls, and then as the mobs are weakening, the meteors start coming down. So the critical chance is some damage. Okay, it's some damage, and it can be pretty nice if you get a crit just to close out like a rare or something like that. Prodigy aspect, the last two are probably the most important legendary aspects. Prodigy aspect you can get from a dungeon. I believe it is in one of the later acts, Act 3 or 4, so it's not going to happen right away. It might be a bit of a pain to play this build. I'd certainly recommend Hydra until you get this, just because it's a mana-efficient skill. So using a cooldown restores 15 to 25 mana. The idea behind this build is that we just use a whole bunch of cooldowns constantly. If your teleport is up, you want to be using your teleport. If a cooldown is up, you want to be using that cooldown. But you don't want to be using it if you have maximum mana. You want to use a firewall, drop your mana below maximum, and then use a cooldown to get it back up again. So a little bit of a bouncing act, but you'll get used to the playstyle pretty quickly, I would say. Aspect of control is the strongest option for this build, so we put it in the amulet to get the 50% bonus. More damage to immobilize, stunned, or frozen. These are separate instances of more damage, so we regularly have frozen enemies that are also immobilized, and it is not, in that case, 40 plus 40. It is 1.4 times 1.4, but because it's an amulet, it's 1.6 times 1.6. If we face off against a staggered boss, it is 3 instances of 60% more damage, stacking multiplicatively. So the control aspect of this character feeds into its damage, and whenever you're stacking, defenses and offenses together, you're going to have a very powerful character. For the Paragon board, I think there are a number of options. I think you will have a little bit of wiggle room, I would say. Mastery skills, I really like there, even though there is like a board with 75 int, I really like the 70 int in the starter board, just because it's pretty efficient, and int is super powerful with burning damage, as we will soon see. The 20 area of mastery skills will of course affect both the firewall and the meteor, and the meteor is not just the impact, which immobilizes, which is amazing, but it's also the burning ground, which is another source of potential firewall enchantment procs. The first board that I'd lead into is Burning Instinct, and I would probably just go forward with the Burning Instinct passive itself. Your burning damage is increased by 40% of your critical strike damage. We have confirmation this is just the bonus from your gear. It does not include the 50 baseline crit multi that every character has. I don't believe it includes temporary effects either, but that probably needs to be tested a little bit later. And it's further increased by 5% for every 20 int that you have, and I believe because int is so valuable in general, but also specifically to scaling burn damage with this legendary node, that you can scale int about 1,000, maybe a little bit higher. So you're going to have a character where whatever critical damage you have on your gear, you multiply that by like 3 and it becomes burning damage. So if you have like 150 crit multi, this node gives you 450% increased burning damage, which is an absolute monster. In terms of the power of glyphs, that is as strong as 2.5 glyphs for burning damage. Now you might be thinking, wait, really? Why don't we all just play burning builds? Well, again, back to the damage buckets. We're getting damage multipliers from vulnerable, from crit, which burns can't crit, and from just stacking damage. But the damage is an entire bucket. Every source of increased damage is additive with each other. So while this is like 450% additive damage, well, most characters are going to be lurking between like 4 and 6, maybe 700% additive damage. So yeah, it's still good. It's still good, but generally it's better to crit in terms of damage output. But it does help significantly that Firewall is an extremely high base damage skill. I do like going through the middle here, damage to burning, damage to elites. This is the only armor node that Sorc gets, so I feel compelled to get it. This is, Burning Instinct is the best dexterity board but the dexterity nodes are not necessarily placed very conveniently. So one thing that I like here, specifically with the burning build, is to put Pyromaniac. Pyromaniac was actually nerfed. It used to be about 200%. Now it's 160. It scales up fire damage and damage reduction modifiers. Now, I actually don't know if this works. I really hope that burning is also fire. The idea is to scale up the damage reduction from enemies that are burning, because this is the main defensive layer, not just for fire damage Sorcs, but for Sorcs in general. That's where you get almost all of your damage reduction. So multiplying that is very good, but we also have to keep in mind that the smaller nodes will also get hit. So that's why this is better than the glyphs that just multiply the rare nodes. Also, every pyromancy skill you cast or channel in the last 6 seconds gives you 2% to a maximum of 10%. This is damage multiplier. So very, very good glyph, but only in this board and only for a burning build. I think after that you have the option of going to Enchantment Master, which is a pretty long trek, but Enchantment Master is going to give you more Firewall procs. The Firewall build has the most damage to gain from the enchantment slots, maybe as much as like the ball lightning build. It's very, very big gain. So multiplying that is huge. You also have the option to put Tactician in the vulnerable board for vulnerable damage. You might choose this option if you happen to get some pretty good gear pieces that have significant cooldown reduction and or Frost Nova skill levels, because that's the only way you actually enable vulnerable damage. I would imagine that will take a while. So I think most people will opt to go for the Enchantment Master first. I like Elementalist here. Even though we don't do any cold damage, unless you go the deep freeze route, we do lightning damage with teleport. And this build, you want to be spamming your cooldowns as much as possible. So with teleport and fire, it's a 10 damage multiplier. And this particular board does pretty well with the non-physical damage and damage reduction. It gives you 5 resists for each of those. It's a little bit better than a rare one. So I kind of like it. It's not extremely good or anything, but it's fine. Going through the middle, you get some pretty good nodes there. And again, Enchantment Master. I would probably then get the vulnerable board, or at least start working towards it. The vulnerable nodes are really good because vulnerable damage is a multiplier. All the vulnerable damage you have multiplies all of your other damage modifiers. And the damage reduction from vulnerable is also really good because eventually we're going to have next to permanent vulnerable uptime, at least on bosses where we really are at risk of getting one shot. Some of these paths though, some of these like long paths, I would wait until the very last few levels. We also have Exploit, which again scales up our vulnerable damage. In the 49 Dexterity Paragon, which is Paragon board, Ceaseless Conduit. This one is really bad. It doesn't really do anything, but because this is the last board we equipped, it's going to require like 500 dexterity for the requirement. We're not going to get that anyway, but we don't even use Crackling Energy, so it's fine. This is very much just to super stack the glyph. And I think overall this will be a very effective character, with the real downside of just being a little bit slow. I think the damage will be there, it'll just be a little bit slower. But I quite liked Firewall, and I will consider this as one of my main builds. But for now, I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you guys check out the future build guides.